Hi everyone, this is part 2 in the making of my snow cosplay from Once Upon a Time. If you'd like to check out part 1, I'll link it up above. So in this part I'm going through the making of the lining, which you can see on the screen now. So that's made out of the linen, and I also go through how I piece everything together to actually form a bodice with no raw edges. I've also been posting all of the progress on this project on my close friends stories on Instagram for Patreon supporters, so if you'd like to check out that and actually keep up to date with real-time updates, then be sure to check out that link in the description box below. So in the clips you can see, I have just gone through the making of the linen lining layer, and it's following the same process as I explained in part 1, and that is sewing the seams together, making sure that I'm matching up the notches. Once I've sewn them, I trim down the seam allowance, I clip the edges around the curves, and as I go through and do all of this, I'm also ironing each of my seam allowances. For some of them I'll iron the seams open flat, like this one here, and for some I'll iron them all down to one side. It just depends on the seam and how much bulk there is. When pinning the pattern pieces together, I usually start with the side front seams first, which has the curved bust seam, and I do those first because they are the most difficult and I want to get them out of the way. And after that, I will then do the side seams, which are straight, and also the shoulder and collar seams, and I do those at the same time. As I said, I iron down each of the seam allowances as I go, and you can see it gets quite a bit tricky with all of the layers coming together and forming the shape of the bodice. But I do my best with the ironing board that I've got, but if you do have I think it's called a tailor's ham, it's much easier to iron out those curved edges. So next up is sewing the lining to the outer fabric right sides together. So I've got the outer fabric, I've got the lining, and matching all of the edges right sides together, I'm going to sew along the sides, and like the sides being the center front, sewing along there, along the collar and down the opposite side, and then flipping it right side out. But before I do this, I need to check the reference image and find out how I need to cut the center front to be a bit more like Snow's from the show. So I'm going to go do that now. So it needs to be like more outwards, like this sort of angle. Alright. Gosh, I'm scared to draw on this side, so I'm going to turn it inside out. Okay, inside out, and then I need to draw the line from the center front. So it sort of stops like here-ish, I think. So I've marked out where I think the line goes. So it goes from about just underneath the bust here, and then extends upwards into the collar. And hers curves more outwards like this. It's a bit more revealing up here, but I'm going to keep mine like that so I don't chop through the dart that's part of this pattern already. Cool. So this is the blue line marking that I've got, and I'm just going to go ahead and chop it. I'm going to follow this line here. Alright, so that's the piece that's come off, and then I'm just going to use this as a pattern to chop the other side as well as the lining. So I've folded this in half, and I'm matching up the center front seam along the top here where I've got this excess fabric that I need to chop off. I'll use this cut off that I did. So I'll match this up here, chop along, following this line. So I've chopped into it, and I still feel like it can go deeper. I just don't want to cut into this dart here. So I'll just cut really close to there, I think. And then I'm going to extend this maybe a bit wider. If I could get the chalk, maybe a little bit lower. So like down here perhaps, and have it round out a bit more up to that dart. So this here is the lining, and I'm just going to use these pieces that I chopped off the outer fabric as a guide of how much to chop off the lining as well. So basically like a puzzle piece, matching it back together. Okay, so I finally finished chopping down the lining and also the outer fabric, so I'm going to sew those together like I said, and I'll come back after that. What are you doing?
Stuff.
What stuff?
Another belt.
Wow.
Whoa.
Which one's this one for?
Shoulder for drifter.
Nice.
Yeah. Okay, I'm filming it.
Okay, so what I'm doing now, like I said, is pinning together the lining and the outer fabric, and I'm using the little clips, and I'm pinning all the way around from the center front, the neckline, up along the collar, and then back down the other side. And then I'm going to stitch all the way around with a 2 centimeter seam allowance. Or maybe it was 1. It was 1 to 2 centimeter seam allowance, I don't know. And then, yeah. Okay, so I've clipped and trimmed the seam allowance all around the edges, so the collar and the 2 side front, and now I'm going to turn it right side out. Meanwhile, you are
doing a thing.
You are trying on your bracer over the top of your coat for drifter. Yeah. Very good. Cool, let's do it. So it's looking good. I've just given it a good press all along the edge. This is the lining, this is the outside, and yeah, it's looking good. And I know that all of the edges will be binded off with bias binding anyway, but I wanted to finish these off like nicely before I did that, just because this is literally fraying everywhere. It's not fun. So I want to sew all the pieces and finish them off nicely before I have to do all of the details like the bias binding on top. Yeah, so that's what it's looking like. I'm gonna go try it on now. So I tried it on and it all looks really good. And because I'm getting really annoyed with these frayed edges on the arm size, I'm going to sew them down and put the bias binding on today. So I've just pinned the lining and the outer fabric together, And now I'm just going to stitch around the arm side to keep those layers together, and then after that I'll apply the bias binding. So now that I've sewn the edge of the whole arm side to keep those layers together, I'm going to apply the bias binding. So I'm first going to pin it to the inside and opening up that fold and pinning it like so. And I'm going to sew along here, and then after I've sewn that, I'm going to flip it to the right side, and then I'm going to top stitch along here. And that's the plan for finishing off the arm side. And when I reach the end, I'm just going to sew those two parts together and then sew along around the arm side. I love it. It looks so good. This is one side done. So I top stitched on the outside. You can see the stitching on the inside lining, but I don't care because that's the lining. And yeah, it's looking good. I've got to do the other side now. But yeah, I'm using bias binding, but on the actual costume, I think they've got leather binding around all of the edges. I'm not doing leather, that's too hard to sew and also very expensive. So cheap option, but still looks good. So the bodice is pretty much nicely finished. The arms have been binded with bias binding and all of these edges have been sewn so that they're enclosed. It's just the bottom part that I've left raw because I need to get onto doing the little panels that attach at the waist. So for the panels that attach at the waist, I've got all of them cut out here. I've got pieces 1, 2, 3, 4 is also in there somewhere. And for each of these, I've got the lining, which is the linen, and I've also got the outer pieces. So for each of these, I'm going to sew each panel piece together, right sides together. So like that. Well, actually it's more like this because the top portion is the shorter edge. And I'm going to then turn them right side out and then attach them to the bodice. So that's the plan for this. So now that the piece has been sewn together, like so, and I've left the top open so I can turn it right side out, I'm going to trim down the seam allowance as usual. And I'm also going to trim the corners as well. So how I trim the corners is literally cut close as possible to the corner seam as possible and get rid of the excess seam allowance on either side of the corner seam. And then time to turn it right side out. And then it's good to use something sharp to poke out the corners and make them nice and crisp. And then I'll give this a good press with the iron after I've done the same process to all the other pieces back there. Hello.
Hello.
What are you working on now?
Crafting.
What are you crafting?
I'm crafting these little foam strips to go on the outside of the drifters braces. Yeah. So I'm just using this ruler to mark the lines in the foam where I'm going to cut.
Very nice.
Yeah.
So here are all the panel pieces turned right side out, and it's time to take it to the ironing mesh board to iron. So I've ironed all of them flat, and the next thing I'm going to do is apply the bias binding around all the edges, and then after that I can attach them to the bodice. So I'm going to apply the bias binding the same way that I did on the bodice arm side, where I just open up the fold and then sew along the fold, and then turn it to the other side and then do a top stitch. So that's the plan for that, and I will check back in after that. So here's one panel done. This is what it looks like. I've kept a majority of the bias binding on the back because I just wanted the front to be a little bit slimmer, and I had a bit of trouble with the corners, so I might hand sew like just anything that's coming out a bit. I might hand sew that down so it's a bit smoother from the front. But other than that, it's looking pretty good. I know it's a little bit counterintuitive to like sew all these with nice seams only to go on top of it again with bias binding, but I think having that additional seam allowance in between helps with a bit more structure and support in these, so I don't need to use any interlining. And basically, yeah, that's it. I've got to repeat this another 7 times, so yay me. So all the panels are now sewn. I've put in the bias binding around all of them. As you can see, the corners are not the greatest, but that will do. I'm very happy with how they've turned out. They've got a good stiffness to them. And now I just need to attach these to the bodice. So it's actually like turned out that these are pretty much identical. So I have no idea which one's like piece number 2 or number 3. I have a feeling that is 3 and that is 2. That one, number 4 is the longest, so I think that's 4 and that's a 1. So these will be on the front, that will be on the back, and those are the side ones. I'm going to add them to the bodice now. Yeah, let's go do that. Actually, I'm sort of thinking I need to first trim this down just because it's all like a weird length. So let's do that first. Yeah, that'll do. And literally, let's just cut straight across. Fold it over just so we can get that symmetry going. Okay, it is done. Give that a good shake. Get rid of all of this scrap. Okay, hopefully this is better. This is the center back, that's the center front. I've got the half laid out here, the other half is over there, and I'm going to start pinning the panels. So this is the back panel, and what I will do is pin it right sides touching from the center back. Yep, so then panels number 2 and 3 need to somehow fit in between there. Oh goodness me. Did not measure that correctly, did I? Actually, this fabric seems to stretch. Maybe I can make it work. Let's try it again. All right, so that's half of it pinned. I've got center back here, center front here, and as you can see, I had to overlap these pieces by about that much, just because there isn't enough space in the back, so I did, I guess, screw up my measurements a bit, and I'm just hoping that it doesn't look too odd. Yeah, I hope that looks okay. Yeah, and like the back is the back, like who cares, it's fine. yeah, I'm not sure if I should put these panels over the top of this one. Maybe I should, I can't tell. I'm gonna go have a look in the mirror and then I'll come back and let you know what I end up deciding. Okay, so I'm back now and I have decided to just squeeze the pieces in as best I can. So the fabric has a little bit of stretch on this, like on the horizontal where the waist is. So I'm just stretching the fabric just a tad, just so I can try and squeeze all of these pieces in, because it just looks strange if they're overlapping and I really don't want them to overlap. So I'm really hoping that I have enough space to squeeze this last one in. Oh, hopefully. Okay, I think I managed to do it. I had a bit of trouble back here, but I think it's good. It's gonna be a bit puckery, but from the outside it should look fine. Hoping, fingers crossed. Anyway, I'm gonna sew all along that line and then we're almost there. So thankfully I managed to get it all in. I did have a bit of weird puckering like this, and you can see a little bit of it there. And on like the inside, it doesn't look too great at all. I mean, that's what we're looking at, but I'm happy with how it looks from the outside, and that's what matters. So I'm going to give this an iron, and then basically when I turn it to the inside, after I've given this a good iron, I'm going to iron all of this seam allowance upwards into the bodice area. Actually, let me zoom you in. There we go. So once I've ironed up all the seam allowance into the bodice area, the lining will sit over the top like that, and it will give it a nice clean finish on the inside. So that's the plan there. I might give all of this a bit of a trim as well, just to get rid of any of those like really chunky bits, like this maybe. We'll see. But yeah, that's the plan, and we are so close. Really looking forward to finishing this today, like this portion of the costume. Right, so I've ironed all of this seam allowance upwards, and then the last thing will just be to iron the seam allowance of the lining upwards as well, so that all matches. So I'm just going to iron it maybe 1 centimeter or so up like this, and then I can take it to the sewing machine and top stitch that all down. So like I said, we're just putting the lining over the top of these raw edges and covering that. And I have a feeling I might need to hand sew all of this down because it's not lining up properly to the front. So my best bet might be to hand sew this down, which is fine. I can do that in front of the TV while watching once. But yeah, same process. Keep pinning. So I finished sewing the lining. I hand sewed all along the edge here to encase the raw edges, and I just used whip stitches all the way around with a double thread, and that completes sort of the bodice. I still need to do the neckline and collar binding, but I will leave that for another time. but this is what she's looking like so far, and very pleased with it.